No, okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to, second time around, acknowledge my co-authors, Robbie Bishop-Taylor, who's led the remote sensing analysis of this research, and my colleagues, Stephen Sagar and Leo Burma. It's very much a team effort. So the Australian coastline, we know that it's long. It's a 30,000 kilometre long coastline, and slightly longer. And Andy Short has looked at every one of the beaches around the Australian continent, a lucky man, and he's been able to describe the 10,000 odd beaches that make up our coastline. But in addition to those beaches, we also have tide-dominated muddy coastlines. So we tend to talk about coasts in terms of tide, wave, or fluvial dominance. You can see across the northern parts of Australia, we tend to have tide-dominated to tide-modified beaches, and around the southern coast, we have wave-dominated beaches or coasts. But it's probably more useful to consider the three processes that combine to influence the coast. When we think about depositional systems and the complexity of the fascies that make them up, it's important to consider not just these ternary processes, these primary processes, fluvial, wave, and tide, which sit at the apices of the ternary plot of fluvial, tide, and wave domination that you've probably all seen before. It's these areas in between that introduce a lot of complexity into the coastal depositional system and in the way that they evolve and respond to changing drivers. You can see up here from the fluvial delta discharging into a still body of water, such as a lake perhaps, in the absence of any sort of significant tide or wave energy. You get a fairly straightforward system, but as you move across to the right-hand side, you get a lot more complexity introduced as you get wave or tide influence on that system. So, given that the present is the key to the past, I'm really hoping that you'll see through the talk tonight that DEA Coastlines is an excellent resource for you and your students to better understand coastal evolution and depositional environments that are of interest to you. So DEA Coastlines. The data set provides annual coastlines, so annual polylines or contours of the coast, and rates of change around the entire Australian continent from 1988 to the present. So that's 30,000 kilometres of coastline, that's 33 odd years of data, that's about 1 million kilometres of mapped coast, mapped at 0 AHD, at approximately mean sea level. And the Coastlines product combines satellite data from the Digital Earth Australia project with tidal modelling to more accurately assess the position of each of those images that are used in the production of the data set. So it's a really important advancement in this product, is it coupling it with tidal modelling. So that looks a bit like this. Just get a little bit into the background on this because it's based on the Landsat data set, and you may be aware that the Landsat data set has about a 30-metre pixel resolution. So a lot of our beaches are about 30 metres wide, so you might ask, what sort of potential does this thing have for my setting? My wave-dominated beach, it's quite steep perhaps. I thought the same thing when I was first invited into the project and thought this will be interesting, and it really has been. So the way that they've done it is you get the full observed tidal range between the highest observed tide and the lowest observed tide. You take 50% of that observed tidal range to set the envelope of images that you're interested in. I should point it out, each of these points represents a single Landsat image that's been taken at various levels of the tidal cycle. So from 1.5 metres down to -1 metres. You see that varies with time. If you take the inner 50% of the observed tidal range and you centre that over 0 mean sea level, then you get an average intermediate shoreline position. And again, you might think, oh, maybe that'll work. Just to look at that in a slightly different way, exactly the same method I've just described. Here's the satellite, the stack of images for an entire year on the left-hand side. The middle stack shows you the images that remain after discarding the low and high tide images, those that are taken at high or low tide. And then these are combined into a single noise-free annual image that you can then undertake further analysis on. I won't get into the specifics of how this is done. Robbie's written an entire paper on this. But essentially, a water index is used to separate the land in the top right quadrant of that image on the left from the water in the bottom left quadrant of that image. And a subpixel analysis algorithm is run on it to extract the coastline at a level of precision much finer than 30 metres. So in order to address some of the concerns around, can you really do this? Can you get to the level of detail that we need to see? We've validated this data against 56,000 data points across the continent. This is the distribution of these validation data sets from the Sunshine Coast in southern Queensland up here, round through Tasmania, across the southern part of the continent, all the way up past Broome in Western Australia. And you can see these data sets have varied from being primarily aerial photogrammetry and hydrographic survey earlier in the record until the last few years where we see a large spike in LiDAR and drone photogrammetry. So there's a broad suite of validation data set types and a lengthy period of validation data over the entire record. Certainly lends support to our interpretation of it. So this is how some of these comparisons look. The top example there at Cape Peron, you can see the DEA Coastlines is the orange line, and this axis is the distance along the transect that coastline has moved from 140 metres to 260. So in this case, where the coast is eroding, we're tracking that erosion through about 120 metres of shoreline loss, shoreline retreat. And the blue line is the validation data set. The validation data set is based on aerial photogrammetry. Here, you can see from 1990, 95, so on and so forth, about every 5 to 8 years. They've run these air photos collection exercise. They've gone through the expensive process of collecting it and interpreting it in a more manual manner. And it pretty much correlates to what we've got in the DEA coastline. So the further advantage you can see in this image is that the intervening years are also captured in DEA coastlines. So you don't just have a line every 5 to 8 years, you have a line for each and every year. And that can become really important in places where you want to identify what the driver is of change on a shoreline. So it may be that you want to capture the cyclone event that passed through and see what the coastline did in response to that. You can see it in the DEA coastlines data. And another way of looking at the correlation between the validation data and DEA coastlines is this one here at Narrabeen, where you don't have significant retreat or progradation of the shoreline. Instead, you have a fluctuating shoreline. And in this case, the shoreline's fluctuating across about a 30-metre wide shore face. It's moving backwards and forwards with each year. It doesn't look particularly systematic. And this figure here is really just to illustrate that grey swath across there is the width of a 30-metre pixel. And nevertheless, DEA Coastlines is tracking the validation data set pretty closely. It's pretty accurate stuff. So enough convincing you. Now we can just have some fun and have a look at some of these coastal systems. So the DEA data set, DEA Coastlines data set is really 3 data sets in one. The first data set is this one that you've just seen a little bit of an introduction on. These are the annual contours with the one contour representing every year of record, from the darker colours, always representing 1988, through to the brighter and lighter colours in 2019. So this coastline here has been retreating quite rapidly. So the rate of retreat and the nature of that retreat is captured in data set 2. That is a whole bunch of 30-metre space points spaced along the most recent coastline that summarise the mean rate of coastal movement, in this case coastal retreat, from 5 to 10 metres per annum. Excuse me. This is in Chambers Bay in the Northern Territory, and it has some pretty rapid rates of retreat. Now that's useful to see it at that level, but if you want to have a look at a more regional to continental scale, you need to look at data set number 3. And these are the summary statistics down here. That's that area there, there's this one here. And you can see 5 kilometre space points, averaging shoreline movements over the adjacent, over a 5 kilometre envelope, moving along the shoreline there. So the neat thing about what you can do with the point statistics data set, when you go into DEA coastlines, you can click on one of these points and a graph like this will open up. So you'll be able to see with time how quickly that shoreline's been moving, and you can compare one section of shore with another section of shore. In this case, at Transect B here, in this embayment, you can see that in 1998, that shoreline started to retreat pretty rapidly at about 13 to 14 metres per annum. But you can see at Transect A, in front of those mangroves there in the tidal creek, it was retreating at about half that rate. And from this, we'd infer something must be causing those differences in the rates of retreat. And on the right-hand side here, this is a couple of images of what was going on that coast between 1998 and 2019. So we're seeing this rapid retreat. This shoreline here, this is a Landsat image, so this is the sort of resolution imagery that we're dealing with. You can still see that there's a mangrove fringe all the way along the coast there. But by 2019, the mangrove fringe has disappeared, and you only have the mangroves persisting inside the tidal channels. And it's those tidal channels that are resisting the rate of retreat of that coastline. We would infer from this that it's probably got something to do with the mangroves providing the resistance to the energy that's eroding that coastline. But that's assigning exact causes is beyond the scope of this presentation. So just bringing it back to the ternary plot, the process classification I was talking about earlier, we're going to keep returning to this so you can see the distribution of depositional system types that we're going to be looking at. And in this case here, this is a TWF. It's a tide-dominated, wave-influenced, fluvially affected system. So it's mostly tides, it's a little bit waves, and it's hardly any fluvial. So let's take a national tour and have a look at this right around the continent. This is the data set 3 that I described. So this is 5 kilometre space points around the entire continent. And these are plotted along respective axes that represent the regions of interest. So along the northwest coast here, you can see that this particularly rapid rate of 5 kilometre average rates of retreat are about -4 metres per annum. And this is in Chambers Bay, where you've just seen that example. Other examples are, say, in the Gulf of Carpentaria. This corresponds to this plot over here, Carpentaria Coast, and that's prograding in the south of the Gulf at about 2 metres per annum. So you can really easily pick out where the hotspots are, progradation and retreat. Obviously, really huge importance for coastal managers, but also shows you where some of our most dynamic systems potentially are. But of course, we'll have a look at this in terms of the process diagram, particularly steering clear of those end members and looking more at the complexity that you get in mixed energy, mixed process depositional systems. So the first detailed example I'll show is Ringarooma Bay on the northern shore of Tasmania in the Bass Strait. This is a wave-dominated, fluvially influenced, tide-affected system. So mostly waves, a little bit of fluvial, microtidal, so not much tidal influence here. And this is a net erosional system. This has been eroding over the last 33 years of the record and quite significantly in places. So looking at some of the worst of this erosion is here at Tomahawk Beach. So when you look at Tomahawk Beach, you can see that certainly the shoreline has been retreating through there. We get an average rate when we look at the data set 2. But when you look at the detail within data set 2, you can see that while the mean rate of retreat is about 4 metres per annum, there's actually 2 distinct rates of retreat. Firstly, a pre-2001 rate of retreat of about 7 metres per year, and then it slows significantly, which would seem to imply, obviously, a slowing of the system, a slowing of this erosion. So because DEA Coastlines is only looking at 33 years of record, it's important to, wherever possible, look at the longer term record. Talking to geologists, so I'm sure you appreciate that. In this case, I managed to get hold of an air photo and rectify it, and I was able to map the vegetation line here. You can see that in 1970, the vegetation line is about where it is today. So between 1970 and 1988, that shoreline prograded, and it's now retreating, and it's readjusting. It's reaching some sort of well, it's returning to a former condition. And if you look even further into the past in this particular location, there's been a number of papers published by David Knighton on the sediment transport down through the Ringarooma River to the coast. So this was an area of extensive tin mining in the 1800s through to the mid to late 1900s. There's a huge amount of sediment coming down this system. Now I can't remember the exact figures, but they were very large, and they've impacted on what is now the Ramsar wetland. But that sediment wasn't just stored in the wetland, it was definitely exiting to the coast. And so that sediment was available to this, what we call a tertiary coastal compartment, which is marked by these 2 limits here. And a tertiary coastal compartment is essentially a coastal system that adjusts itself in a fairly synchronized way. You would expect sediment moved from one section of the coastal compartment within such a compartment to be moved alongshore. You see synchronized movements, erosion in one area, progradation in another, erosion offshore, it can be reworked back onto the coast in a matter of years to decades, so quite a fast response. I think that's what we're seeing here. This is a short-term adjustment to a longer-term process of artificially high sediment supply rates. So moving across to the other side of the Bass Strait, to Corner Inlet, this is the first series of barrier islands in the 90-mile beach long chain of barrier islands, and I think they're the largest ones in Australia. And this is a system that has a bit more complexity, but it's net progradation. It's mostly been accumulated sediment. And this is a wave-dominated, tidally affected system. There's almost no fluvial input into this system. So zooming into Snake Island in particular, you can see here, this is the sort of longshore sediment transport dynamics I was just describing, where at the northern end or eastern end of this beach, you're getting retreat rates of about 20 metres per annum, this red line here, about 20 metres per annum. This sediment is being moved alongshore to, first transect here is Beech, so the most proximal transect, has been prograding, and it prograded pretty rapidly until the early 2000s, when it plateaued off and that beach stabilised. But the transect C, further away, distal to the source of that sediment, has been prograding at a more constant rate. So it's an ongoing adjustment, and a nice example of the way that sediment can be moved alongshore. If you want to look at why a site is eroding or why another site is prograding, it's important to look longitudinally along that coastline to see if you can see why. Another example, and this is a purely wave-dominated system in Western Australia, and I've had a lot of fun looking at the DEA Coastlines product in Western Australia, because their coastline is affected by a combination of offshore reefs that protect the coastline from the prevailing wind climate, which is from the southwest, the large swells, and a net northerly longshore drift direction. And the interaction of those two factors tend to drive the development of a whole series of really well studied cuspate forelands like this one that tend to be asymmetrical. So they get sediment accumulation on their updrift side and erosion on the more sediment-starved downdrift side of them. Now this system's been developing for over 6,000 years, 7,000 years, and you can see it developed this kind of cuspate morphology by at least by about 4,000 years. So this is an unusual morphology. And zooming in on that, you can see that that northern coast there is eroding at quite a rate, up to about 1.82 metres per year, while this southern side has been prograding most recently. You can see from these old isolines from the large beech ridges that characterise this plain that the 1,500, 2,000 year beech ridges have been truncated by erosion. But you can see also that this general morphology of the trending of the foreland growth is still quite consistent. So it's important to remember when you're looking at areas that are eroding that it can also be part of a cycle of progradation with intermittent erosion, storm activity that reworks that sediment up to form a beech ridge before it again commences the cycle of progradation. Okay, so moving up to Roebuck Bay in the north of Western Australia up here, we're now in a tide-dominated wave-influenced system. This is another tertiary coastal compartment marked by these limits. Sorry, my mouse doesn't work very well. It's marked by these limits, but you can see two really contrasting trajectories of shoreline change. This red shoreline here, racecourse plains, is comprised of clastic material, and this has been eroding at very fast rates. Whereas within Roebuck Bay, the protected section of Roebuck Bay, you have a mangrove fronted shoreline, and it's been prograding at almost exactly the same rate. So the erosion has been happening at nearly 7 metres per annum, while the progradation has been occurring at about 6 metres per annum. So the connection between racecourse plains and the Roebuck Bay embayment is evident in this plot, where we've got a 3-year moving average of movements at these two contrasting transects. You can see here where you get pronounced episodes of erosion. On the open coast, you get pronounced episodes of progradation. Again, here you see a big pronounced episode of erosion coupled with a pronounced episode of progradation up in the mangrove embayment. And you can see that there's no such relationship in the last few years. So there's a decoupling of that system. So where this is going to go in the future is not immediately apparent from this. And while the sediment transport pathway appears to have been from south to north, well and truly into the bay for the last first 20 odd years, it's not ongoing. And it may be that these mangrove fronted shorelines are starting to change in the way that they're responding to whatever the drivers are of that erosion of the outer or exposed shoreline. Okay, well, when you hopefully open up DEA Coastlines and have a look at it, every now and then you're probably going to find a place like this that looks a bit of a mess and you think, has it really worked? A couple of things to point out here. These overlapping contours are solid lines, and so we have reasonably high confidence in their position for the year, in their accuracy. You can see these ones here have dotted lines, and that's to imply that we're just not too sure whether or not those lines are accurately capturing the shoreline position for that year. So if you see dotted lines, take them with a dash of salt. And if the next slide works, I'll be able to show you how you can unpack the processes that have been happening in a place like this by creating a fancy video like this one. So you can see a recurved spit growing towards the west, attaching to that western shoreline and breaching over in the east. And that's having a huge impact on the change that's happening landed in that protected environment. So it is worth taking a much closer look at sites like this. It's not working, it's just these are complex multi-process systems with, in this case, tides, waves, and some fluvial. Now you can't always make a fancy video out of it, so I've shown you an alternative way of doing this here. Here's another relatively complex system up in the Gulf of Carpentaria with overlapping contours that looks a bit messy, but if you break it into two epochs, you can see that you've got this early development of another recurved spit, the extension of the recurved spit with the tidal channel in behind it. And you can see the migration onshore of this mid-tidal bar or this tidal bar, and it's welding here to the shoreline in 2007. And from that point in 2007, it attaches and oscillates a little bit in its position, and the recurved spit starts to grow at a much faster rate. Now this is all quite a lot of detail, isn't it, I guess, so it may not be immediately apparent why this is important to a room full of geologists. We're looking at some pretty fine resolution of detail. Some people would complain these are only annual average shorelines. I would argue that we're interested in the net effect of every year of change, and that it still reveals an awful lot of data that can be difficult to unravel what's exactly happening. So the next thing I'm going to do is show you what I would have done with this had I had my time again and had this product been available when I was working on the Mitchell River Delta. So the Mitchell River Delta is up in the Gulf of Carpentaria on the eastern coast, the western side of Cape York. And this is an asymmetrical delta. DEA Coastlines has captured, I forgot to put the scale bar on, it's about 1 kilometre across here. So this rate of retreat here is up in the order of 5 to 6 metres per annum. This side of this delta is retreating. And this side here is fairly static and stable. Now these are beech ridges here. Beech ridges are on the wave-dominated southern portion of this asymmetrical delta. And these are tidal flats and chenier ridges on the northern side. So flows come out from the Mitchell River and they skew northwards. Longshore drift supplies much coarser grained materials at the southern side of the delta, and a lot more muds are deposited on the northern side. And chenier plains develop through the accretion of primarily fine-grained material that gets winnowed back in storm events and pushed up to form chenier ridges, so coarser grained material atop muddy tidal flats. This is really important for understanding the distribution of sand and potential reservoir, what we call potential reservoir for this modern analogue for ancient hydrocarbon-bearing asymmetrical delta systems. So we didn't have DEA Coastlines, and we didn't have even Arc-to-Earth plugins. We couldn't view that sort of imagery in ArcGIS at the time, so we imported a whole bunch of images that we captured from Google Earth to come up with complicated figures like this one that show quite a complex distribution of what are grouped into tidal, wave, and fluvial deposits that make up this entire coastline, this entire depositional system from about the 7,000 year mark back here, which we've dated. And we can see that the system has migrated through wave and tide domination with time, and different parts of the system are more wave dominated and other parts are more tide dominated. So this modern analogue here that we've been looking at, the modern coastline, with the wave domination on the south and the tide domination on the north, you can see it in our mapping. These yellow sand ridges, beech ridges on the southern side are wave dominated, and on the northern side, they're tide dominated. We can see that this first started back here. This is at about the 2,000 year mark. They've got wave-dominated beech ridges on the southern side of the Mitchell paleomount, and we've got tide-dominated on the northern side of the paleomount. And we use this to map the distribution of mouth bar sands across the delta, which was really helpful for our sponsors who wanted to know what the geometries were of those target sand bodies in similar systems. And a map like this, in as much detail as it has, was used subsequently by Bruce Ainsworth and others. You can see they've flipped it around so that north is now towards the bottom of the page. And it's a perfect, almost perfect analogue for the Drumheller Lower Horseshoe Formation, Lake Cretaceous system in Drumheller in Canada. And importantly also up here, Tessa Lane and myself and our colleagues expanded on this detailed mapping, and were able to map the movement of the system through tide dominated, wave dominated, and various categories. And these categories that the Mitchell River Delta evolved through over its 7,000 years of development almost exactly match the diversity of the depositional systems that I showed you in all the preceding slides. So there's a lot of variation within each of those categories, and there's a lot of different areas around Australia that you could use as an analogue to help you understand a Holocene system like this one, which I hope would then contribute to your understanding of more ancient systems. Yeah, so I guess where are we going with this next? An obvious thing for us to do is to have a look at what drives coastal change in the DEA Coastlines Data Set, besides the temporal trends that I've been showing you. So something I probably didn't make clear enough at the start was that all those sites we've been looking at have strong temporal trends. They're either prograding or they're retreating at statistically significant rates that we can use time as a strong indicator of how that shoreline's moving. But lots of shorelines don't do that. Lots of shorelines are more oscillatory. And in this case here, you can see we've plotted up the relationship between the shoreline movement and Southern Oscillation Index variation. In this case, we're seeing about 10 metres of erosion per unit of increase in Southern Oscillation Index. So you can predict that if you're going into a La Nina period, your shoreline's probably going to shift 10 metres length, and vice versa if you're going into an La Nina event. Now, obviously, this is the East Coast, so there's a lot of Southern Oscillation Index driven coastal change, but the rest of Australia has the Matt-and-Julian Oscillation across the top, and the Indian Ocean Dipole on the west coast, and the Southern Annual Mode on the south coast. So there's lots of different climate systems that we're going to look at next to see if we can figure out what primarily determines change around the Australian coast. And who knows, that might provide you with analogues for different depositional settings in different climatic systems and different receiving basin types. So, yeah, I'd encourage you to have a bit of fun touring around Australia and then look at DEA Coastlines. Have a look at where you might have properties or friends have properties and the beaches that you know best, and get your eye in for what's going on. But I really think this has got a lot of potential for teaching. I'd imagine if I was still lecturing, I'd be putting a whole course around the coastal geomorphology, and I can see that in a product like this. I'd be asking the students to look at that ternary plot, and I'd be asking them to find a fluvial dominated system in Australia. I wish them luck with that. And we can now, I might have gone a little later time, we can now go and have a look at the DEA maps online if you'd like. Yeah.